Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's been a pleasure to come out here to Fairfax. I don't think I've been out this way since I taught at George Mason last semester, but it was a really wonderful semester that I spent there teaching a course on the memoir. I had a great group of students and enjoyed just being out here. This is a lovely library. One of the things that I brought today, you'll probably see this picture down here and wondering, well, who is in that picture? That is my grandfather, Jim Richardson. And as I've been talking about this book, I've been bringing this picture along. Just, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but a picture is also what launched several thousand words for me to write this book. So it was this picture when I was a boy, sat in my parents' closet. It did not hang in our house, and growing up in Mississippi at the time, it could not hang in my house because you really couldn't claim kinship with a white person, and there were consequences in Mississippi if you did. And things that would be checked by the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, which was Mississippi's spy agency during the Civil Rights Movement. So I've been bringing my grandfather's picture along. It's been hanging in my house since I was married 20 years ago. And so now I'm bringing it. It's come out of the closet, it went on a wall, and now I'm taking it on the road. But what I'm going to be reading from tonight is The House at the End of the Road, and I've been asked very often, is this really a follow-up to Ever is a Long Time? It's really very different. It's a book more about race and identity in American society as seen through one American family, the Richardsons, who were my grandparents. When I was working on Ever is a Long Time, I was asked I was teaching at Cardozo High School in Washington yesterday, and one of the students asked me, well, what is your process in working with your editor? Just very curious about that. I said, well, I send half of the manuscript generally to my editor, get reactions, and get things back. Well, I sent the first half of Ever is a Long Time to my editor. She said, I'm really interested in your grandparents. You've only got 2 paragraphs on them. What can you write more about them? I said, this is all that I know. I mean, I don't know any more than this. And I became very interested in them, and I asked my mother some about them, and actually ended up doing a StoryCorps interview with her that helped launch this book, but it wasn't the StoryCorps interview that really got things started. So I'm going to read from 2 parts of the book tonight. I'm going to start out with the prologue, which will give you, I think, a sense of how this project really got started and its roots, and why it's something that I felt as a writer that I had to do. The hardest thing I ever did was to ask a white man to marry his daughter. I heard my father say late one night to my mother when they thought I was asleep. Then there was a pause, as my father took a drag on his ever-present Salem cigarette. And I'm not sorry that I had to do the asking. It's all been worth it. The 2 of them laughed tenderly, which I felt in their voices, since I could not see the expressions on their faces. It was 1973, and I was an innocent 16-year-old, blanketed by naivete, lying awake in a room filled with boyhood toys and model airplanes. Though I tried to listen as my parents talked into the night about how they forged ahead with their marriage, in spite of different backgrounds, I remember almost nothing of their whiskey and nicotine fuel discussion. Rather, I remember how puzzlement filled the air of my room like the smoke from my parents' cigarettes, and crept into my brain as I attempted to process that my mother's much-loved father was a white man. My grandfather died 6 months before I was born, so I knew him only through the stories my mother told. I just assumed since my mother was black, so was my grandfather. His race was never discussed, and in Mississippi in the 1960s, it would not have been discussed without severe social consequences for my parents. Now I understood why my grandfather's portrait sat in my parents' closet, emitting a dusky evanescence from behind the closed door. Yet that evening, overcome with adolescent narcissism, I thought only about how what I had just heard affected me. The impact on my mother of living in a mixed-race household in the Jim Crow South of the 1930s stood invisibly in a dark corner of the room. With a consciousness rooted in black pride in the civil rights movement, I quickly concluded that my grandfather's race had nothing to do with my racial identity. Soon I was fast asleep, leaving my parents' conversation to drift into the night air. Almost 30 years later, memories of that evening began to come back. My mother and I were together with my daughter Delaney in her school for a classroom presentation about holiday memories. After the children told their stories about family Thanksgivings, Delaney innocently asked my mother to tell her about the most memorable Thanksgiving from her childhood. Holding tightly to her emotions, my mother struggled to tell Delaney about a special Thanksgiving when her mother's friend, Miss Callie, came and made a big dinner just for the children and played games with them. It was painfully clear to me that that was all she could say without losing her composure in front of a kindergartner. When we left the classroom, we stopped on the front steps of the school on the way to the car. "What happened that Thanksgiving, Mom?" I asked quietly, sensing that she was still upset. Then, standing ramrod straight and glancing directly into my eyes, my mother began to tell me a story I had never heard. This time, I did not let my thoughts drift away as I did all those years ago. Instead, I listened intently as the memories etched lines of pain on her face. When my mother died, for a brief time, I felt like I became invisible, she told me. And the Thanksgiving I was trying to talk about was when my mother died. My mother, Lucille Richardson, was only 7 years old at the time, old enough to know what had happened to her mother, but young enough to slither through the rooms of her house unnoticed by her father, who was devastated by his loss. My mother recalled that all the mirrors in the house were covered with thin white sheets, perhaps to keep her mother's spirit at rest. That made it easy to sneak around. As she surreptitiously watched her mother being placed in a casket wearing a powder blue dress with a white lace collar, a dress her mother had sewn with her own hands, Lucille wondered what would happen to her now that her mother was dead. In spite of her ability to hide and eavesdrop, she struggled to decipher what the grown-ups around her were saying about her future. Then, just days after her mother's burial, she found herself sitting on the back seat of a 1936 Ford with her 9-year-old sister, staring through the car's rear window as her white clapboard farmhouse at the end of the road got smaller and smaller in the distance, finally fading into one of the clouds of dust that billowed behind the car. Sent to live with relatives in Mobile, separated from the home she loved, her older siblings, and her father, Lucille did not know when she would return. Before she could come back to her house at the end of the road, her father had to figure out what to do with his family. Would they stay in Alabama, or would they move north to pass for white? It was something that was whispered about among the family, something Lucille overheard and finally connected with an incident from a few years before her mother died. That day, her father, Jim, was injured in a logging accident a few miles from their house. After the accident, a group of men, all of them white, brought him to the house. Confused by all the commotion and her father's cry of pain, Lucille turned to her mother's friend, Miss Callie, who had helped her form her most vivid Thanksgiving memory, and asked, what's wrong with Jim?